Welcome to a Talk Tools webinar. Today's presentation is Nonverbal Autism, How to Break Through with Talk Tools instructor Riska Solomon. So just real quick, with a show of hands, if you can please confirm that you can see me and hear me. There's a little hand icon on your control panel. I do see those hands going up, so thank you. But if this is your first Talk Tools webinar, there are two important features I'd like to point out. We do have a questions tab and a handouts tab. So if you have any questions for our instructor, go ahead and submit that through the questions tab throughout the presentation, and then we'll have a little Q&A at the end. And then any of her handouts, takeaway resources can be found under the handouts tab for you to download to your computer. And what should you expect after the webinar? We will be sending a follow-up email to all participants. And in this email is a link to today's recording. Please keep in mind that all Talk Tools webinars have an expiration of 30 days. Also in the email is your certificate, all of the copies of the handouts, and the required course evaluation survey. So that is required to receive credit for this course. And if you are seeking ASHA CEUs, this is the same survey to submit your ASHA information. So if anyone has any questions about that process, or if you haven't received that email within the next 3 business days, please email us at continuingeducation@talktools.com. So thank you again for joining us, and we hope you enjoy your time with Riska.
Thank you, and welcome everybody. Hope everybody's keeping safe in these very strange times. I'm looking forward to talking to you about something that I'm really passionate about. I am a board certified behaviour analyst, and I run Skybound Therapies, which is a multidisciplinary clinic and outreach service that's based in Wales, UK. And in Wales, we are still on lockdown here. So I usually like to demonstrate a lot of the techniques, and I usually have one of my team members with myself. But part of our lockdown restrictions that they've actually made legislation is that staff members have to stay 2 meters away from each other. So I couldn't have somebody with me on this webinar, so I will try my best to explain all the procedures. And then in the handouts, there's a lot of detailed written notes as well. So why am I doing this webinar about nonverbal autism? I think as parents, we all want our children to be able to communicate effectively. Lack of communication can cause behavioral issues through frustration, not being able to get their needs and wants met. We can teach every person to communicate to some degree. Here at Skybound, we actually work with a variety of individuals. The vast majority of our caseload is autism, but we also actually work with individuals with brain injuries and chromosome abnormalities. And as such, we just taught one young lady with brain injury to press a switch with her head using ABA, and also she's now just learning to press another switch with her foot, so as she's got 2 movements that she can do. There are a wide variety of techniques out there, and a multidisciplinary approach is often needed, is what we find with these individuals with complex disabilities that are non-verbal. A holistic approach looking at many aspects of the person is needed to maximize learning, and we'll be talking a lot more about that today, and how we have come to develop case conceptualizations of the individuals with autism that we work with that are nonverbal and have been nonverbal for some time. I absolutely love this quote. The failure to acquire spoken language has been noted to have a significant negative impact on the quality of life of those with developmental disabilities. The development of speech within this population, however minimal, constitutes one of the most significant predictors of positive outcomes, including decreases in behavioral symptom severity and improved socialization. This quote also comes from the same paper both Howlin and colleagues and Modi et al. Emphasized that the ability to speak even a few words in this population is the single most important predictor of positive outcomes, such as symptom reduction and increased socialization in later years. I think those two quotes are really powerful because with many of the individuals we work with, we get them referred to work on developing speech when sometimes they're a lot older. They are, late childhood years, early teenage years, and we can still have really good outcomes with developing speech. We had one young child not young child, he was a child of 9 years old. And when we started with him, he had significant issues, behavioral issues. He would spit everywhere. And yet now at 13, he's got a large number of words that he uses to communicate all of his needs and wants. And actually, I've been there. Our family have been through all of this process with Dan. There's a picture of Dan and myself in Florida, which is his absolutely favorite place. We've taken him about 8 times now. He loves Universal and going on all the rides. But he had no communication when he came to live with us. His mum was a heroin addict. He was born addicted to Valium, and he came to live with us when he was age 4. He had absolutely no communication. He had very, very severe challenging behavior. He would bite us, kick, hit, smash things. It was really bad. He wasn't toilet trained. He smeared feces up the wall every day if you weren't with him every second. We had no idea when something was medically wrong or whether it was behavioral, the behaviors we were seeing. He had no toleration of anything health or medical related. So trying to check out whether he did have something medically wrong when we thought he might be in pain was almost impossible. And he had absolutely no cooperation to do anything. One of his speech therapists, he was in a local special school at the time, and the speech therapist there said, there was very little hope for him. He was trapped in his own little world, which was really sad to hear. So I knew a little bit about ABA at the time, and I decided to go off and change my career direction. I should have been training to be a learning disability nurse, but because of Dan and the fact that he needed a home for the longer term, I went off and trained to be a behavior analyst. And I eventually moved out of my home, and he still remains living with my parents and then with us as well. So we share him, and we are now legal deputies for him. He's now 23. If you'd have told me we'd have been able to keep him at home at 23, when at 4 and 5 he was really quite unmanageable, I'd have been very shocked. But thanks to ABA, we managed to work on lots and lots of proactive skills to teach him all the things he needed to decrease his challenging behaviors and to give us a better quality of life. But the most important thing was to develop some speech. So we were given permission to start ABA with him when he was 7. We first taught him to sign, and then we tried to develop some speech sounds, but he didn't develop many at all. He developed about 3 until I found Talk Tools when he was 12. And we then began implementing Talk Tools within an ABA program. And he now has lots and lots of words. It's in excess of about 120. And considering we only started teaching him any speech really at the age of 12, that's quite a lot of words for him. And it's made a huge difference to our family. For example, when we first took him to Florida, it was at age 12, and it was to see Renee Roy-Hill from Talk Tools. And, he had no words. He had some signs. He had quite a few signs, but if we were in the car on the way to the airport, you can't hear him signing toilet. Whereas now when he says we know that he needs a wee, he needs to go to the toilet. And that made a huge difference for every time we were going anywhere with him. He can call us from the other end of the house. He can ask us for any help that he needs with getting his needs and wants met. So it's been really transformational for him and many of the other young people we work with. So I'm very, very passionate about it. But what we found was that Dan really needed a multidisciplinary approach. ABA gave us how to teach him, but it didn't necessarily give us what to teach him. And actually the skills that we needed to teach him came from all of these different professions that you can see on the screen. We have worked with occupational therapists. He continues to work with occupational therapists and speech and language therapists. We have worked with dietitians, gastroenterologists, phlebotomists, dentists, teachers, podiatrists to get a biomechanical assessment of his walking. With many of the other children, things like gastroenterology is really important, so as we can actually work with the gastro to take data on their food intake, their bowels, etc. Phlebotomist for blood testing. Everybody has their place in the team, and we absolutely love and are very passionate about working as multidisciplinary because all of these different professions have such a wealth of knowledge that can help us with non-verbal individuals with autism. So ABA is the science of how to teach. It's not necessarily what to teach. And that is where all of these other professionals really have their part to play. And it's also, we apply it in many other realms as well, including in business, in managing Skybound. I use organizational behavior management. We've also used ABA to teach leisure skills such as horse riding. We work with the local Riding for the Disabled Association group to teach individuals with complex autism how to horse ride. And some of them have got up to a stage where they can horse ride relatively independently within a safe arena. And we've also used ABA to teach swimming. We actually have 2 qualified swimming instructors on our staff, one that's a behavior analyst, and we've also put our occupational therapist through ABA training and swimming training, because her knowledge of the physical movements as well as then how to teach individuals with complex autism is through using ABA is just so powerful when it comes to teaching swimming. And we're a big believer in teaching swimming to individuals with complex autism because of the risks of drowning if they abscond, if they elope. Many people do think of ABA as early intensive intervention or a set of particular procedures. And I hope through what I've just told you that actually it's really not that. It's not the early intensive intervention or a set of prescribed procedures. It's the science of human behavior. And when you understand the basics of the science, you can apply it to anything and everything. So when we come to thinking about nonverbal individuals, what do we mean? Within ABA, we actually class verbal as the ability to communicate in any way. So this could be used on augmentative or alternative communication system, or through vocal communication. And our goal is always to teach a child to be as verbal as possible. And so sometimes an AAC system is a short-term component, and sometimes it may be a long-term component of this mission. If we give a person communication, life will get better for them. Giving non-verbal individuals the ability to communicate is vital. It reduces behaviors and enables them to have some appropriate control over their lives. And much of my job as a behavior analyst overlaps with our speech and language therapist here at the clinic, because it's all about how can we increase communication in order to decrease behaviors. There are so many things to teach though. How do we decide? And yes, within ABA, there are lots of great assessments. There's the VB-MAP, there's the ABLES-R, there's Peak Relational Training, which is a really great assessment tool and curricular guide. But there are other things we have to consider when trying to work out what are the things we need to teach them. And we are very much focused on social significance. We don't just follow a curriculum. We don't just follow the BBMF or something like that. We want to look at what is important for that individual and their family. What are the biggest things impacting on the child's ability to progress? What are their barriers? How can we decrease their barriers to increase their progress? How do we teach people where to start with skills, especially with communication? How do we teach people to work out what are the biggest barriers and then how to overcome those to enable the individual to learn to communicate? How do we teach people what order to address things in? We have a lot of responsibility as parents and as professionals to make sure we get this right, because if we get it wrong, it can slow their progress down. I developed the concept of these sliders to help me conceptualize the strengths and needs, particularly of these very complex non-verbal individuals with autism that were getting referred to our clinic. What I found with Dan and with all of the others that we've seen is it's not just ASD that we have to take into account. Yes, we do have to look at their ASD severity, which can include looking at social motivation. We know that if social motivation, if they have lots of social interactions that they enjoy, that is an indicator of better outcomes. We look at their obsessive interests, their stereotypy, their joint attention, and oppositional behaviours. We have a lot of people referred to our setting that display oppositional behaviours that have been hard for people to assess in the past. And just yesterday, in fact, one of our consultants was working with a teenager who has recently started a program with us. He is incredibly challenging, self-injurious and aggressive, and has a significant amount of problem behaviours with relation to food, toileting, all sorts. And actually yesterday when we did an assessment of him, we found that his biggest reward, that is his biggest reinforcer that increases behaviours, is to be quite severely told off. And we tested this yesterday, and without a shadow of doubt, every time he was told off, his behaviours increased. And that is how he has come to actually develop some very, very significant behaviours. So it's really interesting, and that's where the functional and assessment and analysis part of ABA is very, very important. We have to look at what is motivating for these individuals, what reinforces their behaviours, because it is different. When we look at the second slider, it's learning difficulties. And with this one, what we're really looking at is how quickly can the child learn? How many appropriate behaviours do they already have in their repertoire? How much interest in their environment do they have? Do they explore things? Can they learn to access things they want quickly and easily? Motor skills. There's much research to show that individuals with autism will have or can have gross fine and oral motor skill delays. So what we want to look at is what is the extent of their difficulties. Are they able to manipulate small items? Can they put items into other items? Can they walk, run, jump? Can they drink through a straw? Can they chew? And that can they chew is a really important one. Just this week, we've had somebody referred that we were told had behavioural issues with feeding, and actually on closer analysis, it turns out that he sucks all his food because he doesn't have the motor skills to be able to chew his food. So it's really, really important that we look at all of these skills, and all of these areas, all of these sliders can impact on the development of speech. There are so many prerequisites to speech that we really have to make sure we're looking at all of these sliders. Health and medical issues. We spend a lot of our time analysing in case there may be health or medical issues. There are some great resources out there, in some pain inventories. So for non-verbal individuals with autism, the use of pain inventories can be really advantageous. And there's a great book as well that's available specifically around pain in individuals with learning disabilities. So if you'll get my email address at the end, if anybody wants that in the reference for that book. Age, we also need to consider how old they are. Obviously, a younger age is easier to teach many different skills. We want to consider social motivation programs. The youngest on my caseload at the moment is 7.5 months. and they have been highlighted as potentially being on the spectrum because of the lack of social motivation. And so that is what we're working on at the moment. A recent case we had was a 2-year-old girl, and she wasn't walking. And so we've used ABA to work on her walking, and now she is walking independently a year later. We worked collaboratively with her physio, but the biggest problem was actually motivation with her. With an older age, you've got a history of behaviors, they're ingrained. But that doesn't mean we don't see success. We've actually used speech programs well into adulthood. I think the eldest we have taught some speech sounds now to is, I think, about 28 that we've worked with just on specifically on developing those speech sounds. There's a great paper about ABA across the lifespan, and now ABA is also used in gerontology as well. There's a lot of work being done with ABA with dementia, for example. We've actually just quoted a local care home for some behavioural work with them about increasing skills, maintaining their skills for longer for their dementia residents, and decreasing challenging behaviour. And the last slider to consider is contextual issues. How much time are parents able to devote to interventions? How much therapeutic input does the child get? How much consistency can we establish? And are there other factors affecting family? And this is really, really important when we come to consider how we're going to develop speech with these complex individuals. This is how we often put the sliders together when I am training up my staff to look at each individual and develop a case conceptualization. And so, for example, this child was initially, from their intake, it looked like their ASD severity was more affected, their learning difficulties significantly affected, motor skills significantly affected, health and medical issues not so much so. They were only 2 years old, but they had some contextual issues in that they lived in a country where actually there was no ABA funding whatsoever. Both parents needed to work, and so they had very little access to actual therapeutic input. When actually we assessed the child, actually what we found was that although at that stage, at 2, the motor skills were significantly impacted and they did not have many skills in their repertoire, actually what we found was that the ASD severity was so significant that they had no interest in their environment and the world around them. And so if toys or anything that they did like went slightly too far away from them, they actually would just give up and go to self-stimulation. They would immediately go to tapping and moving their feet and to waving their hands in front of their face. And so this was a matter of motivation. So we used applied behavior analysis to get them motivated and to begin teaching them motor skills. They weren't able to crawl, so we were able to teach them to crawl. We were able to teach them to stand and then teach them to walk through using ABA. And so this is where these sliders can come in really handy, because actually what is the most significant challenge to them? And that's where we need to then focus. And for this child, actually, we were able to, we said we can't actually judge the learning difficulties and motor skills, how affected they are, until we actually work on the decreased social motivation and the lack of motivation, especially when there's an increase in response effort. I like to use Dan as an example, and this is how we sort of case conceptualize Dan. His ASD severity isn't too bad. He can be fairly flexible. We can change plans and things readily. He's always been quite a thrill seeker. He doesn't have too many sensitivities and things. However, his learning difficulties really are significantly impacting on how quickly he can learn. His motor skills are fairly impacted. He has dyspraxia, he has a dysarthria and verbal dyspraxia as well. And he has significant health and medical issues. So we, for Dan, had to spend a lot of time initially working on diet, and working on all of the medical issues around his toileting. He has irritable bowel syndrome, and so he's on a very restricted diet now, which initially was causing a lot of behavioral issues because he doesn't understand why he needs to be on that diet. He was older when we started ABA, and the contextual issues were less than optimal initially because he was with us on foster care, and so we had to get approval for everything. We had to fight for approval for things. So the contextual issues were significant. So when we first began working with Dan, we focused on sorting out those contextual issues, getting him more therapy, making sure he got good quality therapy. We focused on getting a gastroenterologist, a dietitian, and a nutritionist on board to help the ABA team to work on those issues. And then we focused on teaching him how to learn. And you see, that's where these sliders can be so helpful to conceptualize each case and then make sure we target the right areas. Once we had got the health and medical issues, the contextual issues under control, once we taught him how to learn skills, then we started working on motor skills. That came in next. And we had to bear in mind as well about his age, because we needed to make sure we taught as many functional skills as possible before he became very big and would be intimidating within the public with some of the behaviors he had, as he was so aggressive when we first began working with him with ABA at age 7. So here's some of the questions I tend to ask our team when we think about ASD severity. Can we teach using their obsessions? Can we do token boards that fit with their biggest interests? How can we increase social motivation? How can we pair ourselves? How can we be the givers of all good things? How can we make them want to be with us? Well, that's the key. If we can make them run to us rather than run away from us, then we have got the ability to teach. We want them to want us to be involved in everything they do because we are so much fun. How can we ensure that our teaching is not making people be seen as aversive? How can we take into account their sensory issues? Really, really important that if we want to teach them, we have to be aware of the sensory issues. If the sensory issues aren't impacting significantly on their lives, then we may not need to directly work on them. But if they are and they're socially significant, then we will work on them through doing systematic desensitization at their pace so as it's not aversive to them. And as I talked about before, we have to remember that their motivations may be different. We are getting an increasing number of children that are reinforced by social disapproval. And that's something to really look out for. If you have those children that are quite challenging to work with, make sure somebody has assessed what form of attention maintains that child's behaviors, because social disapproval we see in quite a significant number of children that are referred to us now. With learning difficulties, essentially the question is, how many trials does it take to teach a skill? If it takes 2,000 trials, you need to make sure the skills that are on acquisition are the most important skills. And with Dan, when we first taught imitation, it did take, upwards of 1,500 trials to teach one imitation. However, as it says there, if a child does need a large number of trials, one of the goals of our teaching should be to reduce the number of trials it takes to learn. And one of our goals with teaching motor imitations was that each motor imitation we wanted to see get less trials to be able to master it. And we will take data within the programs to see how many trials is it taking to master that program. And we'll also take very step-by-step data on all of the prompt levels. So when we're teaching speech, we really want to know exactly what prompt level we're having to use in order to get a successful response. And then we want to systematically fade those prompts. And if we don't see those prompts being able to be systematically faded, there's something not right and we need to make a change. We don't want a child working over and over again on the same trial on the same skill without making some progress. Motor skills, really important to look at the gross motor, fine motor, and the oral motor. With some individuals, we have to do a lot of work with our occupational therapist professionals in order to improve their motor skills. One of the key things is to teach motor imitation, as that helps us develop speech, and I'll be explaining more about that. But if you've got a child that has really poor gross or fine motor skills, then motor imitation can be quite challenging for them. And so sometimes we need to actually go and teach those motor skills in conjunction with our occupational therapist colleagues to be able to then develop the concept of motor imitation. And that's the same basis that Talk Tools works on. Teach those motor skills, then you can put into function. And that's what we do with gross and fine motor. We work with our OT colleagues to teach those motor skills that we can then put into a task such as motor imitation, or into a task such as self-help skills. But all of this still is building towards speech, because if we can teach the gross motor imitation and the fine motor imitation, then they have developed the concept of imitation, and oral motor is the finest fine motor imitation. So it's really important. Health and medical issues I've touched on. There's just some references there. There's a great sleep book. When we're trying to teach nonverbal individuals something as difficult as developing speech, and it can be quite hard if they've had all of the usual approaches, then when we come to using our approaches to develop speech, they're quite a lot of response effort. We need them to be able to attend. We need them to have had good quality sleep, ideally, and to not be in pain. If a child's in pain, they won't learn. And so this book, A Clinician's Guide to Helping Children Cope and Cooperate with Medical Care, is a really great book. It's an applied behavioural approach to teaching an awful lot of medical skills, including blood tests, diabetes checks, all sorts. There's MRI procedures, EEG procedures we have used these principles with. Age, does it matter? It will have an impact on the priority of skills to teach, and how much time can we take to teach speech? Does everyone agree to the need to focus on speech? We see a lot of people that think, well, if a child hasn't learned to talk by 6, they're not going to. That we know just isn't true. We have taught many individuals older than 6 to develop speech, but we are aware that we have to balance this out and look at the case conceptualization sliders and see what is going to make the biggest difference to the individual to have a better quality of life. This slide at the bottom here about transition planning, for example, this slide actually is from Peter Gerhardt. He is a fantastic behavior analyst who focuses on adolescents and adults. And I just love his slide, and it really makes you realize here that it says on this left-hand column, 5 years of transition programming. So, people start off thinking, yeah, we got all the time in the world, we got 5 years. And he worked out that equated to 208 school days per year, 5 potential hours of intervention time per day, which leaves us with 1,040 hours of intervention under ideal conditions. An individual typically has about 30 individual objectives, a total of 150 individual objectives across 5 years. And this leaves about 7 hours to teach each objective to mastery and ensure maintenance and generalization under ideal conditions. And so this is why we say that age does matter, because if the individual does not have much ability to communicate vocally or using an AAC device, that's where we need to put our time and energy, because as the research at the start of this webinar explained, having communication, and particularly having vocal communication, leads to a significant improvement in outcomes and in quality of life. And when you see it like that, if they've got IEPs that have other targets on that are not going to be immediately functional or very functional once they are taught to maintenance and generalization, we need to be looking at those and thinking, well, actually, do we need to get more communication? Do we need to get speech onto their IEP? The contextual issues, when it comes to developing speech, it is something we really have to consider, because these techniques take a lot of trials. Many of the people that are referred to us have already tried many of the easier techniques and have not been able to learn to vocalize consistently. And so these techniques take a lot of trials, and it takes consistency and fidelity of the procedures. Another way we look at how to decide on what to focus on first is actually taken from acceptance and commitment therapy. And that's where we do the 3 wishes exercise. We ask the family, what are your 3 wishes for your child? And then those 3 long-term wishes, we then turn into short-term goals for the child. And we do that with the family. And the 3 wishes exercises is really great. And we often do it with families for their child, for the family as a whole, for family relationships and things as well. So one of the first things we do when looking at communication is to assess for a communication system. And the Essentials for Living book is fantastic for an assessment called the Alternative Method of Speaking. And this compares the different skills which may impact on a person's ability to use a particular communication system. And this link here, amscompare.com, it actually enables you to fill it out and compare it to all the different communication systems. You do need the book though, because it just numbers the communication systems. It doesn't tell you exactly what the communication systems are. I know this is a little bit blurry on your screen, but if I just sort of talk to you about it, what we look at is the sensory, skill and behavioural repertoires in this first column. So we look at colouring in whether they are hearing, whether they are sighted, whether they are hearing impaired, visually impaired, hearing and visually impaired, ambulatory, non-ambulatory, whether they are active or inactive, whether they have good fine motor coordination, whether they have limited or no fine motor coordination, whether they are able to motor imitate, whether they have limited or no motor imitation, whether they are able to do photo or printed word to item matching, whether they have limited or no matching, and whether they're moderate or severe problem behavior or no moderate or severe problem behavior. And so you fill in each one that's relevant to your individual, and then you compare it to the grids in the book. Well, that website will actually do it all for you. And what they've done with, I think there's about 45 different communication systems that are contained within this assessment. And it's brilliant because then it looks at the characteristics of your individual, and it then tells you which of the 45 communication systems would be best. And then what it also does is it compares those communication systems to the advantages of saying words. We all know that speaking has many advantages. And so it looks at the portability. Children and adults can convey messages at any place and time without environmental supports. It looks at effort. Information can be conveyed with little effort. Complexity. In the beginning, only one-step responses are required. And then moving to complex discriminations. It looks at the communication skills. Many requests can be easily conveyed. Many items, activities, people and places can be clearly named or described. Answers to questions can clearly and easily occur. Conversation can easily occur. Reading can be taught. Requests can be conveyed in the absence of what is being requested. And then audience advantage, the speaker can be understood by a large audience which does not require specific training to understand them. So this method of the alternative method of speaking is a really great assessment. We also want to look at eye contact and gestures, and especially when we're working with young children. The young children we work with, we focus on using the Early Start Denver model with, and we focus on using ABA to shape gestures. There is the 16 gestures at 16 months information, which is great. Within Early Start Denver model as well, if you're working with younger children that are nonverbal, they have a great flow chart that describes, and it's a sort of a decision tree within their manual. And it's really, really useful to show that We want to start working with individuals with more naturalistic reinforcers, with more social reinforcers, with sort of less confined teaching, so more naturalistic on the go teaching through play. However, if we don't see enough progress, then we can systematically move through their decision tree until we get to more of a traditional ABA approach, if you like, where they are sat at a table and working for sort of, you know, edible reinforcers and things like that. But what the decision tree shows is that actually there's a whole host of other steps that we can do before we have to get to that very structured approach of teaching. And where possible, we really want to focus on doing more naturalistic teaching and more use of more naturalistic reinforcers. Sign language. So in your list of handouts, you have got a sign language training protocol. We teach sign language through specific teaching protocols, and usually at this point I would demonstrate and model with a colleague, which is most unfortunate. But when we come to teach sign language, what we want to do is make sure we establish something that the individual really wants, and then we want to check that they continue to be motivated for that for a number of trials, because we want them to be able to have a number of opportunities to learn this the sign that we're trying to teach them. And so what we will do with this is we will give them a free go of their preferred item. We'll then hold it back and wait for them to show signs of motivation. And what we want to do is that teach to the reach. We want to teach to the smile. When they are smiling, when they are reaching for something, we know that they're motivated, and therefore that is when we will model the sign. For example, our sign for bubbles is this. We'll model bubbles and we will say bubbles. So we will go bubbles, then we will physically prompt the individual to do the sign. We will often be taking into account their motor skill ability, and we will work with occupational therapists to work out, can they do this? Can they do this? This action is very difficult because it's moving away from the face and it's moving to no point of reference. It can be quite hard because there's no point of reference. They don't normally touch their face. So we'll work with the OT sometimes to modify the signs. For example, says they've got a point of reference, touching the cheek and doing that. We will work through very systematic prompt stages. We will first begin with full physical prompts, then we'll move to partial physical prompts, then we hopefully get to motor imitation, where they can just imitate us doing the sign. Then we might move to a vocal prompt of saying the name of the item, bubble. Then we will move to the item just being in sight, and our ultimate aim is that they can request their needs and wants when the item is out of sight. So we actually have a whole hierarchy as well of fading the presence of that item until it is out of sight. And we will take data at each stage. And if they are not progressing, then we will make sure we actually make a change to their program so as we can see that progress. So sign language is really useful. It has a lot of similarities to speech. It has a different sign for each of their needs and wants. They can carry it with them, but you know, there are disadvantages in that unless somebody understands sign language, they may not understand what the learner is requesting. Picture exchange communication system, lots of people know about. It was developed by a speech therapist and a behavior analyst. The PECS manual has lots of ABA written into the manual. It has a whole section, a whole chapter towards the end of the book on the use of PECS within ABA programs. It's very popular due to its specific protocols that mean that large amounts of success can be seen. However, we've seen those large amounts of progress as well with other communication systems when we have designed and implemented with fidelity the specific protocols. So, you know, that it's one to consider and it's one we use. One of the downsides we see is that some children are reluctant to use PECS, mainly because of the response effort that they've got to look through things. And, you know, that's especially if they've got a lot of communication pictures in their book, it can take a while and it can be high response effort. But for some of our individuals, it's worked really, really well. We use a lot of communication apps as well. So we use Proloco to go a lot. Many people do believe you shouldn't begin with a voice output device until they've achieved successful usage of a picture system. However, we have seen some children do well on Proloco to go from the outset. And we also use some other communication apps as well, depending on the budgets that the children have. And so, you know, we will look at some of the free apps and things if the parents having to buy the communication system themselves. But Proloco to go is probably the most well known here in the UK. And we have had a lot of success with children using it. We've actually developed protocols, and I believe I have actually given you one of the Proloco to go protocols we use here is in your handout list. We have developed protocols for Proloco to go as well to encourage speech. So much like with PECs, when you are at phase 4 and you've got the sentence strip and then you pause and wait to see if they vocalize, what we've actually been able to do with Proloco to go is for some of our individuals that we have taught to speak but have significant verbal apraxia, what we've managed to do is to get them to use Proloco to go as their vocal model. If they struggle to get to a stage where they can spontaneously say the word due to their dyspraxia, then we have actually been able to teach some individuals with complex disabilities to use Proloco to go as their model that they can then echo and go and tell somebody as well, which has been a really great use of that system. So requesting is the key to communication. Babies learn to communicate their basic needs and wants through crying. Then we learn more advanced forms of communication, but some non-verbal individuals, sorry, just finding my cursor, some non-verbal individuals only have the basics and do not progress from there. Their cries develop into tantrums, which develop into aggression and or self-injury, and we see this far too much. So we need to teach requesting, and the basics of requesting are just to, as I talked about with the sign language, to establish motivation for a preferred item, to prompt the communicative behavior, and then to provide the preferred item. And that is the basics, and you'll see it in much more expanded detail in some of the protocols in your handouts. But those are the basics, so it doesn't matter what communication system we are doing, those 3 basic things need to happen. We want to make sure they have got motivation, so it's a genuine request. They're then more motivated to actually engage in the communicative behavior. And if they are very motivated for it, the delivery of the preferred item will be a reward for the communication behavior that they just developed. So that reward will then increase the likelihood of them exhibiting that communicative behavior in future. And that's what we term as reinforcement. If a consequence causes a behavior to increase in future, behavior analysts call it a reinforcer. Okay. Key to this is identifying preferred items. There are preference assessments, there are indirect and direct preference assessments that can be conducted. The indirect preference assessments tend to be watching the individual, so in their own home or in a clinic setting with plenty of items out for them to interact with. We can watch the individual and record what items the individual interacts with and the duration that they interact with those items. Direct preference assessments, there are multiple different ways of doing this. You can do what's called paired choice, where we present 2 at a time of items to see which one they choose. We can also do a multiple stimulus with or without replacement, which involves us presenting an array of items we think might be preferred for the individual in front of them. And then what we do is we ask them to take one, and we can let them experience and have access to that preferred item. If it's a multiple stimulus without replacement, we would then put that item away and ask them to choose another one. And by doing that, we can actually develop a hierarchy of the most preferred items. And that hierarchy can be really important, because when we're looking at teaching speech, we need the most highly preferred reinforcers. If they have had lots of other attempts to develop speech, then that speech trials can have been paired as something quite difficult, quite aversive. And so we want to make sure we've got this hierarchy of reinforcers, and the multiple stimulus without replacement preference assessment allows us to do that. We put all the items that we think they might like in front of them, and then we see which one they take first, and that can go as our most preferred. And then we see which one they take next and which one they want to interact with after that, and so on. And that will give us that hierarchy. So it's when we are looking to teach them something really difficult that is high response effort, we have got their most highly preferred reward available. But it also means that we can factor in satiation. As we've discussed, some of these complex individuals need a large amount of trials, and we all get satiated on our favorite things. So if the individual has had a lot of access to a particular reinforcer, we can put that reinforcer away and build up their motivation for that reinforcer again, but we can go to our second most powerful reinforcer, or we can go then to our third most powerful reinforcers. And as we just talked about, reinforcers are consequences that delivered after a behavior cause the behavior to increase in future frequency. But most important principle to understand for non-verbal with individuals with autism is reinforcement. We really have to identify what is their motivation. And for many of these non-verbal individuals that may have very limited skills, praise isn't good enough. And praise doesn't cut it when it comes to teaching the difficult skills such as speech that they need to learn. So we really have to identify what are their preferred items. For a typical child, social motivation is often enough. They are often so socially motivated that the praise and the attention they get from other people when they do something right is enough. But for many individuals that we have worked with that are nonverbal, praise often does not serve as a reinforcer immediately. We have to work on pairing our praise and attention with all of the good things that they like, and making us conditioned reinforcers, making our praise, our attention conditioned reinforcers. But often initially that doesn't happen, and often praise and attention isn't a powerful enough reinforcer to teach the skills that require the most response effort. So you really have to think, I always think of a seesaw of how difficult is the activity, then we need to make sure that we balance it out with a highly preferred reinforcer. If the activity is too difficult and the reinforcer is too low, then they won't be motivated to do it, and you'll get escape maintained behaviors. They will want to be trying to escape from your teaching opportunity. And when we're trying to teach talk tools, when we're trying to teach speech, we absolutely need them to want to work with us, to cooperate with us. Whatever communication system you use to teach communication, you need to use systematic programs. We need to task analyze, we need to develop prompting systems, prompt fading, and we need to make sure that we've got checks in there on what is actually reinforcing, that we are not teaching them a communicative skill that actually isn't functional, that they aren't accessing some reinforcement for. This pyramid was a pyramid that I developed with Renee Royhill. And this was from when I first asked Renee to come over to the UK and to see our foster child again. And at the same time, she offered me 4 different time slots, and I said, I'll take them all. And she sort of said, why are you taking them all? I only need to see Dan once. And I said, no, I'm taking them all for the other 4 children on my caseload that I haven't been able to develop speech with using ABA. And she wrote a Talk Tools program for me for each of those children. She went away. 11 months later, she dropped me an email saying, I'm coming back. Do you want me to reassess them? I said, great, come back and reassess them. And she will openly admit that she did not expect to see the progress that these children had made. They had all started learning to speak. And so she asked me how we did it, and I said, well, we basically used ABA to be able to get better cooperation. We used ABA, particularly at step 3 here, you can see, to get sounds on demand. There's a lot of applied behavior analysis literature on how to get that first sound. ABA and speech therapy, there's a lot of overlap, and when a behavior analyst and speech therapist work together, fireworks really do happen. I mean, it is amazing what can happen when we work together. But when we're working in isolation, less is possible. You know, this protocol, Dan Learning to Speak, was only possible through having the occupational therapist, the speech and language, and the behavior analyst working as an interdisciplinary team, not working on their separate programs, but actually working together, integrated, interdisciplinary, to make sure we looked at the case conceptualization sliders to see what was his biggest areas of need, what needed more focus. And so this pyramid, we start off with cooperation, manding, which is requesting that we've just been talking about, and imitation, which we'll talk about in a second. Step 2 is where the oral motor placement, sensory and feeding skills come in from Talk Tools. Step 3 is where we very much are looking at a lot of the ABA techniques to develop speech sounds. Step 4, we look to move from those oral placement skills to then add in the vocalizations that we've developed in step 3 to then be able to get specific speech sounds, often using the apraxia toolkit. Then we look to fade those apraxia shapes to tactile cues, and then we look to fade the tactile cues to independent speech using a word flips or the oral placement therapy to speech kits. And then we also use the Kaufman speech to language protocols as well. And alongside all of that, as a behavior analyst, I am focused on socially significant behavior. So alongside all of that, whenever we get any behavior that can be put into function, we immediately put it into function. So when we get our very first speech sounds, I am then straight away looking at the requests they've learned using an AAC system and thinking, can I pair that speech sound with one of these requests? We don't drop the AAC system, we keep that running alongside. But what I'm looking to do is, can I get now an AAC response plus a vocalization such as an or an or a but, whichever speech sounds they have learned. And then using the Kaufman and Casper sign to say kits, then what we can do is slowly build word shells to increase that ability of manding, of requesting with speech. And that's thoroughly, all of these steps are covered within René's and my Talk Tools class. So within everything that we do, the ABA principles are essential. So the antecedent behavior consequences, the prompting and prompt fading, and we have such a toolkit of different prompts that we can use. Reinforcement, we have some really inventive ways to reinforce children. Task analyses, I love to get, when I'm teaching classes about ABA, I love to get people to work out all the steps to make a cup of tea. If you write down all the steps to make a cup of tea, there are huge amounts of behaviors that you need to do, from grasping the cupboard to being able to pull back and open the door, to being able to let go of your grasp, to being able to get the tea bag out. Yeah, good old British example of making a cup of tea. I'm sure it's more appropriate for America for coffee. But we do love our tea, and the skills are just phenomenal. The amount of skills, if we break it all down, can actually be several hundred. And for many of these individuals, if you've got somebody that on that case conceptualization sliders are impacted on their motor skills, their learning disability, and the ASD severity, we have to take all of those into account, that actually we're going to need a task analysis that is incredibly detailed to teach some of the most functional skills, such as being able to clean their teeth. And this is what's great about teaching speech from a perspective of using Talk Tools. Talk Tools have task analyzed every speech sound and worked out, where do I need my jaw? Where do you need your tongue? Where do you need your lips to be able to produce each speech sound? So as a behavior analyst, I looked at Talk Tools and was like, you've task analyzed all of the minute individual behaviors that you need to do with each part of your mouth to be able to produce each speech sound. So now, using ABA in their methods, you can teach them. Stimulus control is something that's really, really important. And stimulus control is often an area that is poorly understood, and is an area that I find, if I can explain stimulus control to our speech therapists that we work with, they have a lot more success in their sessions. So to begin that process of looking at stimulus control, If you want to teach your child to talk, if you want to break through and get that first word, or if you want to teach any skill for that matter, you need to understand the process of learning. And that's what ABA is. It's the science of learning. And to do that, you need to understand the antecedent, behavior, and consequence of each skill you want to teach. You need to make your teaching clear. So as you know, what is the specific antecedent I am going to use? What is the behavior I expect, and how can I help them and prompt them and teach it effortlessly? And what is the rewarding consequence I'm going to use to show them that that behavior was correct? And when we come to teaching speech and all motor movements and communicative skills, the antecedents are really, really important, and we'll be covering more on that. So it is now, I believe, coming up to 11 a.m. From where Talk Tools are based. It's actually 4 p.m. now here in the UK. So what we'll do is we'll just have a short break now. We'll have a 10-minute break. So we'll be back at 10 past 4 my time, 10 past 11 on Talk Tools time. All right, thank you. All right, so just a quick break there. All right, so when we look at our ABCs, it's really actually very important to spend a lot of time looking at the most appropriate antecedents when we want to teach. And stimulus control is when an antecedent stimuli reliably evokes a certain behavior. And if there was one thing I could tell you about developing speech, it's you've got to concentrate on what are the antecedents to reliably evoke that behavior. Here's some everyday examples for you. When a telephone rings, it signals that you should pick the telephone up and say hello because there is somebody on the other end of the telephone. So the consequence is that you can have a conversation with the person on the telephone. The antecedent when somebody says hello, if you've ever been walking down the street and somebody says hello and you automatically say hi and then you realize actually they weren't even saying hello to you. That antecedent of hello is reliably, oh, something just happened there, sorry. Reliably evokes the behavior of you saying hello. And so then you can get a conversation from the person that you said hello to. For the antecedent of do you want a coffee, that reliably evokes the behavior of yes or no if you don't want one, and then the consequence of getting a cup if you said yes or not getting a cup if you said no. So stimulus control is really, really important to think about. And stimulus control also even goes as far as you being the stimulus for lots of fun things happening. When they see you, you are the antecedent to great, I'm going to have a great learning session. I'm going to have lots and lots of fun. You are the giver of all good things. To do that, we need to develop cooperation. And you have to say what you mean and mean what you say. Only give demands that are reasonable for the child and that you can help them achieve if needed. We want to make sure that they learn in the most fun and appropriate way possible. And so a lot of the speech work we do has to be done errorlessly with systematic prompt fading. So errorless teaching is where you start with the highest level of prompt that they need to be successful, and then you systematically fade those prompts. Other terms for errorless teaching are most to least prompting, so going in with the most prompt needed and then fading out to the least prompt needed. For developing cooperation, Robert Schramm has got a great book called 7 Steps to Instructional Control. He's also got a free PDF that describes the basic steps, and I would absolutely recommend reading it. But really think about, do you say what you mean and mean what you say? Do you follow through with the demands that you give? And are the demands appropriate? Are you actually giving a demand that you want them to follow through? One of the other things we see a lot of people do is ask questions. Certainly in the UK, we're very polite and we will ask questions. Can you come and sit down? Rather than come and sit down. And so with nonverbal individuals, it's really important to actually get that stimulus control, get those antecedents to be clear and to actually be what you mean, so as then they know exactly how to follow through and that you can teach that through those A, B, C contingencies. Teaching motor imitation was on the bottom of that speech development pyramid that I just showed you. And people, I think, sometimes don't realize how important motor imitation actually is. It's a vital skill that we all use every day. I recently went to the shops for the first time as we're still on lockdown. We can only our essential shops are currently open, which is essentially food shops and things like that. And yeah, I just looked and was imitating what everybody else was doing. Yes, there was some signage everywhere and everything, but you know, it's such a different experience from when I last went shopping, 3 months ago, that I was just looking around, checking what everybody else was doing to check that I was doing the right thing. So motor imitation is something we use all the time, and it's how we learn to do many of the behaviors we need to do. And it's absolutely crucial when we come to developing speech, and you can teach it. Motor imitation is missing in many of our individuals that we are working with that have developmental disabilities, we need to teach motor imitation. And we recommend teaching motor imitation by saying, do this, and modeling the action. We can then prompt the action from the learner, and then we provide the reward. So that is your A, B, C. We don't say wave, because that is then just teaching them to respond to the instruction wave. What we need to teach in order to develop speech is actually the concept of do this or copy me. And that is the stimulus control we want, that when we say copy me, they instantly will look and try and attempt our action. That antecedent copy me indicates that if they do the behavior of copying, imitating what you are doing, that is how they'll get reinforcement. And that's really crucial. We want them to learn that generalized skill of I say do this or I say copy me, whichever one you choose, and you will just choose the one to begin with our learners, and then they will copy you, and that will then lead to fun things. It can be tricky to teach imitation. So we have developed lots of troubleshooting sort of things that we look through if a child isn't making the progress that we would like to see with motor imitation. And we have, again, worked interdisciplinary with our occupational therapist to actually break down motor movements. We don't go for waving to begin with, even though that's one of the early gestures that typical children do develop reasonably early. It's actually one of the harder motor movements. It's up in the air with no points of reference. Some people wave like that, some people wave like that, but there's no points of reference. You're not touching anything anywhere. It is one that is open and in the air. And actually those motor movements with no points of reference, we find consistently are harder for nonverbal or complex autism, with complex autism. So we look at easier motor movements. We look at gross motor movements first. We also look at motor movements that are in sight, and by that I mean that they can see what their hands are doing. This, although I can see myself in the webcam, so I can see it, if there wasn't the webcam or a mirror there, I would not be able to see this motor movement. It is out of my line of sight, and so is this, and so is this. So we look at motor movements that are in sight that they can see. We may look, when we try and teach motor movements, we may look at teaching motor movements with objects first, if that is easier for the individual. And sometimes then when we transition to teaching gross motor imitations, we will look to do motor movements with one hand. So for example, banging on a table. So it's one hand plus an object, okay? So the hand is doing something, if you like, to the object. And we'll also make sure we don't cross the midline, as that can be more tricky. So we're not looking at anything crossing the midline initially. With motor imitation, it's a skill that you should constantly be working on and improving until it is truly functional, until in the COVID era that you can actually look and imitate and work out how you should enter a shop, because that is where now I functionally use motor imitation. Another place I use motor imitation is when I'm driving into London. You know, the junctions are also complicated. I pray that I don't be the first person at a traffic light, so as I can imitate the car in front of me to know which lane I should be going in. So motor imitation is really, really important. And, you know, it's one of the things I would recommend that every professional that works with individuals with developmental disabilities make sure they know how to teach and that they put it into the teaching targets. So as you can see, we've kind of covered the first step there, the cooperation, the requesting, and the imitation. And then TalkTools has some fantastic training around the oral placement, sensory, and feeding therapy. But then from an ABA perspective, we need to look at those getting sounds on demand. The stimulus-stimulus pairing is one procedure, extinction to get sound, direct reinforcement, and also rapid motor imitation antecedent. The reason that we're working on all of these things is to get to what we call the echoics. An echoic is where a learner can echo our model, and those have been shown within the research to be absolutely crucial to be able to develop speech. But we need systematic teaching. So as we talked about, we need the concept of imitation, then we need to the concept of imitating oral motor movements. Some individuals we work with, once you've taught the concept of imitation with gross motor movements, they can do it with anything. But many of the individuals that we work with that are more complex, they can't. And so we actually have to have the steps to teach imitating oral motor movements. And we use some of the talk tools techniques to actually prompt those skills. So we teach the oral placement skill, and then we use those tools that we can get that oral placement on to actually as our prompt, and then we actually fade those prompts until we can get it on imitation. Then we look at teaching voicing on demand, and then we combine those oral motor movements and the voicing to get all of the different sounds. The oral motor movements that we look at are open and closed mouth, blowing, voicing, lip rounding, lip closure, tongue lateralization, and tongue elevation. Within many of the ABA curricula, especially some of the older curricula, there are things like puff out cheeks and things like that, tongue to the tip of your nose. We don't do any of those. None of our behavior analysts will be working on any of those within our practice. And that's because the ones we want to work on are the ones that are needed for feeding, for speech, for blowing their candles out on their birthday, anything that is functional. So any of the non-functional oral motor imitations, we don't tend to work on. And these oral motor skills, something that we've actually been looking at in the last year, is about fluency of oral motor skills. So there is a sort of an area of ABA called precision teaching. And that looks at making sure that not only do you get accurate responding, but you get fluent responding. And fluency is about getting a good rate of responding that is also accurate. So we have to get a good rate and accurate responding on oral motor movements. Now, in the precision teaching textbooks that you can get, and precision teaching is used for reading and all sorts as well. It's got a lot, and for motor skills. It's got a lot of applications. And the way precision teaching works is it has looked at what a regular person how fluent, how quickly and accurately could they do the response that we're looking to teach. And if a typical person can do it at a particular rate, then we want to aim for our learning disabled individuals to actually be able to do it at that same speed. And this is really important, for example, when presenting a webinar such as this. If I couldn't fluently move my mouth to all the places I needed to quickly and accurately, you wouldn't be able to understand what I was saying. And Talk Tools has done a lot of this within their programs. You'll see that they often have requirements of being able to drink X amount through a straw within a set time period. And we've taken this one step further now and are actually working with a clinic called Great Leaps in Florida. And they are experts at using precision teaching. And within precision teaching, they have actually had targets for a very long time. You're talking back, I think, way back into the 70s now, where they actually found that for these oral motor movements, so open and closed lips, a smile, retract, pucker lips, open, closed mouth, alveolar ridge with your tongue tip to stick out your tongue, to lateralize your tongue left and right. The sweet tongue we don't tend to do. And we've actually looked at fluency aims for other oral motor movements that we need for feeding and speech. And what you can see here is that for each of these exercises, there is an oral motor aim. There is an aim of how many times you should be able to do it within a minute. And these aims have come from the typical population. That to be a fluent speaker can move all of their oral motor, they can do all of these oral motor movements within a minute this many times. And it's a lot, for open and closing your lips, you can do it 166 to 294 times per minute. And so actually there's been a study that has shown, so Dana Garner it's an unpublished dissertation that actually showed that oral motor imitation, the fluency of oral motor imitation, so the being able to do it quickly and accurately. All motor imitations actually led to improvements in the echoic measures for target vocalizations, and that they maintained those targets over long periods of time as well. And so what we have done is team up with Great Leaps, because one of the people that consult into Great Leaps ABA clinic in Florida, over at Palm Bay, they are a specialist in precision teaching, particularly around motor skills. And he had done a webinar that I watched just over a year ago, maybe 18 months ago now. And he was looking at how you can teach all of the motor movements, the gross motor and fine motor movements, to fluency. And there's been research to show if you teach the individual motor movements to fluency, that actually that can help with self-help skills without any other teaching, just teaching those individualized motor movements to fluency. And he had a section in his webinar where he talked about these. He showed these and presented these. And the host actually asked him a question and said, okay, but if they can't imitate you, if they can't imitate oral motor movements, how do you teach these? And he actually went, well, I don't know, you can't get into their mouth and prompt it, can you? And that, of course, prompted me to email Jonathan. Amy is his name, if you want to go looking for his webinar. Prompted me to email Jonathan and say, hold on, Jonathan, I can get in their mouths and teach it. We're using Talk Tools. I can develop the cooperation. I can develop and I've got all the tools to be able to get in there and teach these oral motor movements, and to then be able to fade the tools until they can imitate these actions, to be able to get to these fluency aims. But I didn't understand the fluency, and I was like, why is fluency important? And so with the clinic Great Leaps in Florida, we have now, I went over there last September and trained them in Talk Tools, assessed some of their children. They have a great setup because they have an ABA clinic, but they also have an SLP clinic within the same building. And so I worked with their head SLP to assess all of the children. She had luckily done some Talk Tools training, but she didn't understand how it could be applied with ABA. And so with their team of behavior analysts and their head SLP, we assessed many of their children. And we are now currently in the process of evaluating their progress. They have taken exceptionally detailed data on what's called standard acceleration charts. And we have done before and after measures as well. So for example, one of the children we worked with, they have just reassessed, and I think it was something like a 40-point jump on the Kaufman speech praxis test. And the only, between the before and after measures, and the only intervention we have used is the Talk Tools assessments combined with the ABA that we've done. And these children have had excellent ABA in the past, but by combining the SLP and the BCBA's knowledge using Talk Tools, we have been able to actually make some really significant improvements. And they've actually just got a 12-year-old now that has just started saying his first sounds, and they have all got so excited. So watch out for more from Great Leaps. They're just combining their data and putting it all together. I'm working with them so that we can put it all together and get that information out there to everybody. So how do we get the increase in vocalization? So if you've got a child that doesn't vocalize very much, and we want to get vocalizations on demand to be able to get all of this great progress, we need to look at direct reinforcement, and that is when a child says a sound, makes any sort of appropriate noise, that we instantly provide a reward to them, something they enjoy. And so we will often, wear waitress aprons with pockets, or bun bags. I think you call them fanny packs in America. We will have them with all of their fun things in, bubbles, balloons, balloon rockets, anything that they like. We'll have them carried around with us. And then as soon as we hear that child make a sound, we instantly deliver their most favorite item, okay? Then we also have stimulus-stimulus pairing. There's a lot of research done on stimulus-stimulus pairing. It's actually how I started sort of investigating all of the research around developing speech, because I did my dissertation for my master's degree on stimulus-stimulus pairing. It works with some children, approximately 30% of children, and the way it works is you say a sound and then you deliver something rewarding, but we are not expecting any response from them at all at this stage. And you just keep saying a sound, blow the bubbles, bah, blow the bubbles, bah, and you just keep doing that, bah, bah. And what the research has shown is that if you do a high rate of pairing across a condensed time frame, then what you will see is that when you stop those pairings, you will often see a higher rate of that vocalization in that child's babble immediately after that pairing. And what you can do then is if you hear that increase in that sound that you have been pairing with the preferred item, you can then use direct reinforcement. So every time they now say the sound, you can now blow the bubbles. And we can combine these two procedures of stimulus-stimulus pairing and direct reinforcement to get them using their sounds with actual communicative intent. And then we can actually go from there to develop in a coax by adding in a time delay, adding in a prompt and a time delay, adding in the vocal model and a time delay to see if they will then produce the sound. Other ways we can teach voice on demand is through rapid motor imitation antecedent, and there's now a whole book produced around that. There's a whole manual, and that's got some great research. It's worked with some of our children, and for that you need to have very good gross motor and fine motor, and it needs to be fluent. You need to be able to, the child needs to be able to imitate gross motor and fine motor imitations quickly. And that is because the way it actually works is that you say, do this, and then you say a sound, ah. So you might do this, ah. And so you'd want them to imitate all of those motor movements. And then what has been shown is that for some children, they will then come out with a speech sound. One of the ways that we most often get a speech sound on demand is actually to use the Apraxia kit. And here's the Apraxia kit for anybody that hasn't seen it. I usually have some tools with me, but our clinic is seeing people and we can't get any tools and things at the moment out of there if we're not working that at the moment. And I've got a 3-month-old baby, so I'm being told to sort of stay away at the moment, so as there's no risk of us becoming infected, and so I wasn't able to get any tools, but usually I've got some with me. But if you have seen these tools, they are brilliant, and especially with our nonverbal individuals with autism. We can use these tools to actually prompt the mouth position, and so they don't have to worry about where to place the mouth. We can put, I do have a very old ah stick here. You can put the ah stick into their mouth, and often what we will then do is wait, and we will say to them, say ah, and they've never said ah before, but if we wait, then often when they get frustrated, they'll come out of that ah, which we can instantly reward. We remove the block and we instantly reward. With many of the children, we do have to do systematic desensitization, and the way we can do that is we show them the block, we present something good. We show them the block, we give them something good. We show them the block, we tickle them. We show them the block, we give them a high five. And we keep basically systematically desensitizing the presence of the block, and then we might work our way up their arm, but every single step they get something good. Each step as I get higher, they get a reward. The block touches them, get a reward, until I can touch their cheek, the side of their lips, and into their mouth to prompt their mouth open. And that is usually the first sound we get is with the block in their mouth. Wait a little bit until they get frustrated, and because of the systematic desensitization, they're used to the block being placed somewhere on their body and them getting a reward. Well, now because we place that block and we wait, they're so used to getting that reward that they very quickly will try and do something else. It's like, well, what do you want me to do? You know, every time you've brought that block towards me, I've got something good. And this procedure is called extinction. And so we can use extinction to get a sound. They've had an ABC contingency of block is presented, I allow the block to touch me, I get a reward. Block is presented, I allow the block, I get a reward. Now, when that reward isn't forthcoming, they start to work out, well, what else do I need to do? I need to do something to get this reward again. And so most often they will then come out with a vocalization as they are scrolling through all the different behaviors they could do to try and get that reward. And as soon as that vocalization comes out, then we can give the reward immediately. And that is often how we get the first sounds on demand. And we can do a similar thing then to get ooh using the red tube, and also a similar thing with the blue square to get placed between the lips. And so as you can see, we have now started working up through this hierarchy, but the most important thing is to think about that case conceptualization. So as you can work out, where do we need to go in this hierarchy? Do we need to actually go underneath this hierarchy? And first of all, do some prerequisite teaching with the OT on the motor skills. But the cooperation usually is always where we need to start. And then every time we get a speech sound, we put it into the manding with speech. Then we come to look at language versus speech. It's often something that I get asked about. If an individual has significant dysarthria and verbal dyspraxia, and that is affecting the amount they can speak, then maybe we shouldn't work on speech, people say, and maybe we should just work on an AAC device. I have come to find in my experience that actually we should work on both, because for all of the individual's most desired activities, we should work on them learning to say them. That will eventually be the lowest response effort, that they can just ask car, food, we, or whatever you want to use for toilet. Toilet's quite a hard word for some of our individuals. And so we have found that actually for all of the most frequent desired items, we want to work on speech. But then for more complex words and for phrases, we may then use an AAC system. So for Dan, he has all of his most precious needs and wants that he asks for on a daily basis, he can say. But for some of the other things, then he has Proloco to go as a backup. For example, one of the places he likes to go for a walk is called Withybush Woods. Well, due to his significant apraxia and dysarthria, Withybush, with all of its complex sounds, is really, really hard for him. So he can use his Proloco to go to ask for those places. But if his AAC isn't charged, isn't right next to him, if he's cracked the screen on it by accident, it still means he can communicate, because he can ask for all of his most important needs and wants through speech. And that has all been down to properly case conceptualizing his difficulties in a multidisciplinary team to actually identify and address in the right order. And that's the key, is we have to address these skills in the right order that builds towards speech. If we had had a team that the ABA team were over here working on cognitive programs, early learner skills, and cooperation, but then the SLP didn't have those cooperation skills, or wasn't working on those in the same way, or was working on some other targets. And then if we'd have had the OT working on other things, we would not have seen the progress that we did at such a late age. And with non-verbal individuals, especially if they've been through a few different practitioners or been in the system a while, it's really important to get that interdisciplinary working. And Great Leaps is an example of that. They did work together reasonably well, but actually when we really came together and brought the knowledge together, and in addition with Talk Tools, we've seen huge progress, and we've been able to take the data, the before and after measures, and the data during all of the Talk Tools to show that that is what is making the difference. And if the context is not supportive of this, then we have to make some difficult decisions, and we have to go with actually what is most important in this context. And we've had those difficult decisions. There's some individuals that I think with the right context, with intensive support, could have developed some words. But in the countries that they live in the local authorities, even within the UK that they live in, they may not have access to that level of support. If they take thousands of trials per day and they don't have that access to therapy support, then actually this program may not be for them. And that's again why that case conceptualization is so important. to be able to make sure you work on the right skills in the right order at the right time. What we then continually do when we do get some requesting, and with both the AAC and the speech, is we are constantly looking at requesting. We're constantly going back to requesting. The Essentials for Living curriculum that I talked about by Pat McGreevy, that has the alternatives to speaking assessment in, that actually contains over 90 different requesting targets. So those are overarching targets, not the individual goals underneath them, the actual overarching requesting goals, 90 different forms of requesting that they need to be able to learn to do. And the more communication a person has, the more fulfilled life, the more they can actually make their needs, wants, wishes known, and the less challenging behaviours that you will see exhibited. And when it does come to challenging behaviour, we most often are looking at teaching communicative responses for challenging behaviour. And this is where the SLP and the BCBAs need to work collaboratively. All behaviour serves a function. We must identify what that function is in order to effectively teach the person to access the same function in appropriate ways. And the 4 functions we've got are attention. So if we were to find that the challenging behaviours were because of their connection seeking, they're seeking attention, they're wanting that connection with somebody, they're wanting people to pay attention to them, then we need to make sure they've got appropriate ways to do that. We have taught one older teenager to actually say "oi," because that was something he was able to say readily. And now he actually did it in his babble, but we use direct reinforcement of people giving attention, that every time he went "oi, oi, oi, oi," that the parent would turn around and look at him. And now all he does is say "oi," and somebody will turn around and give him attention. And that has led to a significant decrease in challenging behaviour. With sensory, we will often look at teaching communicative responses eventually around them requesting some different sensory experiences that they need to get that they want to explore and have access to. Tangible, it's communication. They want access to an item or object or experience, and so they need those words to be able to ask for them. For example, with Dan, his absolutely favourite word is tub. He has a hot tub in the garden, and whenever he finishes therapy at the end of the day, that's where he likes to go and chill. So he will wait for his staff team to leave, and then he'll turn to me and he'll say tub. And actually, that's one of the few signs that he also kept when we had taught him sign language. But then when we started to teach him speech, and we used all talk tools and tactile cues as detailed in the Apraxia kit, we actually tried to maintain his signing, but he actually would push us away from his hands and take our hands and put them to his mouth because he wanted to learn how to say them. And so he will say tub, and he will sign for it at the same time, and just to make sure that we have absolutely understood him and he has got his point across. And that's really great, because the sign and the speech, and he can shout it at us now. It's quite difficult to shout when you're signing, or to shout with the pecs, but actually when somebody shouts tub at the top of his voice, you know that he really wants that tub, and that you need to pay attention because he is requesting nicely to go in that tub. So also speech, it allows you to show when you're even more motivated, when you're excited, and when you're really angry. And there are some times where if he's told no to going out in the car, such as during lockdown now, he would try shouting car at us to see if that would get a reaction and get the right effect. So within speech, we've got all of those other skills that we can work on as well. With escape, we are always looking to proactively work on making our teaching as fun as possible, but there are always times where us as adults want to escape from demands that we may have, especially now at the moment when I'm doing all of a lot of the admin and work, and I can just say, right, I need a break. I'm going to go and have 5 minutes and have a cup of tea and a biscuit. And actually, we need to make sure that our individuals can appropriately ask for escape, that they can appropriately ask for a break, and that they've got appropriate activities that they can go to get that, to allow them to calm. One of Dan's favorite activities, if he just needs a bit of a break or he's feeling a little bit subdued or under the weather, is to actually ask for music. And it was one of his earliest requests. We taught music, and then blended it all together, got him to blend it all together. We first taught moo, and then we taught moose, and then we taught music. And you know, it's one of his most frequent words. It's one of his most enjoyable activity. Well, it's not enjoyable, it's one of his most calming down. It's not something that we use as a reinforcer, it's something that we use as his chill out, but he can ask for it whenever he wants it. All right, so we did finish a little bit early because I wasn't able to do our demonstrations today. So we've got some time if anybody would like to ask any questions.
Thank you, Riska. Yeah, so we're open for questions now if you guys want to go ahead and type those in. But in the meantime, just a reminder that you will be receiving a follow-up email within the next 3 business days with a link to today's recording, your certificate, and the required evaluation survey.
I've just realized I did take my email address down from the screen relatively quickly, so I'll just put that back up for you as well. And you are more than welcome to email me with any queries, questions, if you want any of our other protocols. I've included a few for you, but if you've got any specific protocols that you'd like, we are really keen to share, because this is a particular population that I'm really, really passionate about. Giving them the tools to be able to speak is what drives me every day. So please do drop me an email.
All right, Riska, well, I don't see any questions coming in, but I also want to remind the audience that Riska does have another webinar scheduled a few months from now, September 3rd. So we hope to see you guys then. Oh, wait, I got a question from Deborah. Is your clinic private pay or funded by the National Health System?
So actually in the UK, it's different. The National Health System does not fund ABA. It's actually an educational need that ABA is deemed in the UK. So I would say probably 85 to 90% of our services are funded by the local education services. So we work right across the UK. We do Ireland, Belgium as well, all over Europe. And I would say that the vast majority are funded through their education system. But we do have some then that access us through private pay.
Great, thanks, Riska.
All right, thank you.
So I guess, yeah, I don't see any more. So I guess we'll go ahead and call it. And we definitely look forward to your next webinar and hope to see everyone then.
Yeah, and we're also talking about doing a potential webinar around the Great Leaps and the data that we've collected there. So look out for that one hopefully in future too.
Awesome.
All right,
All right,
bye.
thank you. Bye.